Welcome to the second part of our conference for today. It's a pleasure to have with us Elettra Stimilli that which will give the first talk of this afternoon. Elettra Stimilli is professor of theoretical philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the Sapienza University of Rome. She directs the editorial series Filosofia Politica and Materiality by the Italian publishing house Quadrivet. She's also part of a scientific committee of the Bloomsbury book series Political Theologies and of the editorial board of the journal Political Theology. She authored numerous essays that revolve around the relationship between politics and religion, focusing on contemporary thought. Her publications include The Debt of the Living, that was published by Sunny Press in 2017, Debt and Guilt by Bloomsbury in 2018, Jacob Taubes, Sovranità e Tempo Messianico, that is forthcoming in English by Bloomsbury, and more recently, Filosofia dei Mezzi, per una nuova politica dei corpi, Philosophy of Means for a New Politics of Bodies, just published this year. So, Elettra, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and the word is you.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Marta, and all the organizer of this fantastic occasion. And I'm very happy to be here. So today I would like to focus on the intellectual relationship between Foucault and Hadot. Yes, well, I believe, but we agree. I think that it's crucial. This relationship is crucial when defining the role of philosophy as form of life. I wrote a text about this issue in 2008, published in an Italian journal, Il Pensiero, and I use the results of this in my books on that. And this relationship was particularly important to focus the relationship between capitalism and asceticism. And so I present the first version of this paper in a conference in Paris last year. So I'm happy to present the second version today. The intellectual relationship between Foucault and Hadot, although marginal compared on the other famous relationship, has left a mark not only in French culture, but into other too. Thanks to Hadot's interventions, it is now possible to more clearly reconstruct the lack of dialogue between the two philosophers. This relationship, beyond some common themes, highlights profound differences, which not only help to identify the main themes of Foucault's latest work, but allows us, above all, to look again at the perspective it opens up on the present. I think it could be said in more than one sense that this report is characterized ultimately as being a failed dialogue. Beyond certain significant common points, it is worth reflecting on the differences. As you well know, the question at the heart of this intellectual relationship is specifically that of spiritual exercises. Beyond the connection to this theme resulting from the dialogue between Hadot and Foucault, what interests me now is trying to highlight some differences which seem particularly relevant for a broader reflection. In other words, based on the relationship between Hadot and Foucault, the object of my thoughts is to recover the role of philosophy as form of life. Philosophy as way of life is a long interview which Hadot recounts his intellect, in which Hadot recounts his intellectual experience as life experience, according to the way in which he interprets the history of Western thought. The cornerstone of his interpretation of ancient philosophy, but more generally of all Western thought, is the idea that philosophy is a spiritual exercise, as we well know. I would like to come back to this focus from a different point of view, I can say. In my opinion, the innovative element of this perspective lies in the fact that Hadot, instead of seeking the pagan origins of Christian spiritual practice, applies the Christian formula to Greek and Roman late antiquity, and more generally, to the whole of ancient philosophy. It is a sort of inversion motivated by the need to explain the problematic relationship between theory and practice, which from Socrates onward is at the heart of the difficulty in defining the philosopher's way of being, his state of extraneousness to the world. If the philosopher's condition implies a disconnected from everyday life, philosophy, in Hadot's interpretation, cannot be identified as the teaching of abstract theories. Rather, philosophy is an art of living, a concrete attitude and a specific lifestyle that concerns the whole of existence. For Hadot, the philosophical act does not concern simply knowledge, but rather the self and the way of being on oneself. It is a profound change, a conversion that overturns the entire life, changing the being of the person who does it. According to Hadot, therefore, philosophy was never just an abstract theory of life. At the same time, it is also a practice, a spiritual exercise to be precise. Not a purely intellectual activity, even if thinking is a part of this exercise, nor is it an exclusively ethical activity, even if the exercises in question refer to the conduct of life. Hadot chooses the word spiritual to define this type of exercise. And according to the inversion I mentioned, he decides to identify spiritual exercise with philosophical practice itself because, in his view, it is clear how these exercises are not created by individual thought alone. Rather, thanks to them, the individual rises to the life of the spirit. In other words, as a spiritual being, each individual forms part of the perspective of the whole. I do not have time to elaborate on the Christian influence of the idea of the spirit, which Hadot did, nor can I outline the links between Christian spirituality and spiritual exercise-related terms which he examines. As you know, these were masterfully researched by Arnold Davidson. However, I cannot leave out an essential aspect of Hadot's discourse for understanding his perspective and generally for contemplating the role of philosophy that interests me. Seemingly, one of the main objectives of Hadot's work is to contrast the specialization of modern philosophical discourse, which has sought to legitimize the mathematization of the universe by the exact sciences, leading to the contemporary drive towards the technotization of man and science. It seems to me Hadot is interested precisely to counter this drive in the reactivating the ancient vision of physics, interpreted by him in terms of a spiritual exercise proper to the philosophical practice. The spirituality having a Christian origin as a practice is thus associated by Hadot with a movement that brings back to the physics, to nature, an indispensable environment for a radical transformation, which allows human life to be brought back to the eternity of the natural order. The critical role of philosophy as a spiritual exercise manifests itself as a sharp contrast to the technotized drive of knowledge. For Hadot, this can only be effective if spiritual exercise is identified with a return to natural eternity. According to spiritual dimension, consists of elaborating of the contrast that exists between nature and technique. This is particularly problematic, deeply felt issue in our time, one of the climatic and environment catastrophes, pandemic crises, and wars in which nature and technology are apparently opposed. As we know, the idea in Hadot's work that philosophy does not only refer to theoretical discourse, but essentially it identifies itself with a way of life, is what interests Foucault. It is fascinating to observe how Hadot's work on philosophy as a form of life becomes particularly relevant in Foucault's research, specifically in reference to his studies on power, and more interestingly, precisely when he addresses the problem of power in terms of governmental power, governmentality, or technique of government. Philosophy as a spiritual and life-over-life exercise is useful for Foucault at the point where he develops the idea of power in terms of overseeing the living as a technique of government. In his 1981-1982 lectures at the Collège de France on the hermeneutic of the subject, there is a well-known passage which I reproduce in its entirety because, from my point of view, it is particularly relevant for understanding what is at stake in Foucault's perspective. This is the quotation. In other words, what I mean is this: if we take the question of power, of political power, situating it in the more general question of governmentality understood as a strategic field of power relations in a broadest and not merely political sense of term, if we understand by governmentality a strategic field of power relations in their mobility, transformability, and reversibility, then I do not think that reflection on this notion of governmentality can avoid passing through theoretically and practically the element of a subject defined by the relationship of self to self. Also, the theory of political power as an institution usually refers to a juridical conception of subject of right. It seems to me that the analysis of governmentality, that is to say of power as a set of reversible relationships, must refer to an ethics of the subject defined by the relationship of self to self. Quite simply, this means that in the type of analysis I have been trying to advance for some time, you can see that power relations, governmentality, the government of the self and of the others, and the relationship of the self to self constitute a chain, a tree, and I think it is around these notions that we should be able to connect together the question of politics and the question of ethics. So, end of quotation. The meticulous analysis of the practices of existence in late antiquity that Foucault developed during the 1981 and 1982 is undoubtedly influenced by those studies in this field. However, in my opinion, the point of view is completely different. Foucault's work takes place with the perspective of studying power as a form of government, of which he had sketched a genealogical analysis. In the lectures of 1977 and 1978 and 1978 and 1979, this takes the form of a pastoral power, of which he identified neoliberalism as the latest and most effective expression. Self-government and government of the others, in his perspective, are inextricably linked. In this context, philosophy as a way of life, as an ethical and currently a political value. It could be said that Foucault associated Hadot's research with a new vision of ethics. Just think to how the name Hadot is used by Foucault in the second volume of the Histoire de la Sexualité in order to realize the revolution that took place in his project. The changes made to the foreground of the work are fundamentally linked to the fact that Foucault clearly identified sexuality as one of the primary experiences through which human beings are directed to focus attention on themselves, to decipher and create themselves as moral subject. According to Foucault, to be considered moral, an action must not be limited to an act or a series of acts conform to rules, laws, or values. This because morality can be a very strong structure of existence without being tied to a rigidly regulated system or codified structure such as a legal system. What is at stake is the fact that ethics implies a certain relationship with oneself. And this relationship is not simply self-awareness, but rather the constitution of oneself as a moral subject. But since there can be no constitution of moral subject without a practice of the self, what we have to study from the perspective of a history of morality, such as the one that Foucault proposes to outline through his history and of sexuality, are the forms that these different practices on the self take on across time. Foucault's interest in the late antiquity, which he had cultivated in the early 1980s, was inspired by the work of Adorno, but his interest in the philosophical practices of the late antiquity is linked to the fact that here, explicitly, and for the first time, life itself becomes a technical activity, as a creative activity, technique as creation. In other words, according to Foucault, what is at stake in the Greek technique to bio, or the Latin ars vivendi, is the idea of a bios, of a life as technical material, and as such, the material of a work of art, and that consequently never simply as a natural dimension. This is, in my opinion, the main difference between Hadot and Foucault. A difference by no means marginal for philosophy and its role, especially in the present. In 1988, on the occasion of a colloque dedicated to Foucault, held in Paris and published a year later in the volume entitled Michel Foucault Philosophe, Hadot made some particularly critical remarks about Foucault, which he later confirmed by pointing out to what may at first appear to be a simple lexical difference. Hadot visibly distances himself from the Foucaultian approach to philosophy. The most critical question for him concerns the meaning of spiritual exercise. According to Hadot, Foucault uses the expression technique of the self to indicate what he calls spiritual exercise, a formula which, in his opinion, expresses the profound distance between their two positions. Hadot argues that the practice defined by Foucault is a technique that focuses too much on the self. Here, in his opinion, an individualizing idea of the subject prevails, a movement of internalization which remains devoid of any relationship with the outside, of the self-awareness as part of nature, was written with a gross N, and universal reason and spirit, say Hadot. As such, the practice defined by Foucault is nothing more than an internalization devoid of the fundamental fact that through philosophical exercise, we no longer live in the human, conventional, and habitual world, but can access the world of eternal nature. Accordingly, for Hadot, philosophy is akin to physics in the sense of the ancients, and physics is a spiritual exercise. In a word, for Hadot, spiritual exercise relates to physics and so to nature. For Foucault, on the other hand, spiritual exercise is fundamentally a technique of the self. Starting from the crisis of the Western reason and the awareness that the idea of the universal reason and the universal nature no longer makes sense today, Hadot set out to develop a model of universal life as a proposition for contemporary man. He considers the model proposed by Foucault identified with an aesthetic of existence, completely inadequate. It is what Hadot considers being a new form of dandyism, fin du siècle. Foucault speaks of dandyism in relation to Baudelaire in his test on Kant, what is enlightenment. Here, Baudelaire is an example of a voluntary attitude of modernity. This is a quotation connected to another quotation, an indispensable asceticism, as Foucault writes in this text. We could say that Baudelaire is an example for a deliberately modern attitude linked to a specific form of a spiritual exercise. Baudelaire's dandy asceticism consists of transforming his body, his behavior, and feelings, as well as his passions and existence, into a work of art. This way of being is not the sign of a formal asceticization of existence, of an individualizing and egocentric mannerism, as according to Hadot, but rather a practice intimately connected to human life, and as such, a creative activity. Modern man for Baudelaire is not one who sets out to discover himself, his secrets and hidden truth, but he is one who tries to invent himself. The modern Kantian critical sense of creativity inherent in human existence for Foucault cannot only consist of a passive reproposition of a model simply identified as a positive as ultimately emerges in Hadot's position from my point of view. This is as true for the techne to bio of antiquity as for the dandy asceticism of Baudelaire, as well as for the Kant's criticism. Foucault, giving positive content to the underlying philosophical ethos, means critiquing who we are, criticizes who we are through a historical ontology of ourselves. And this is the point. The historical ontology. In short, it is a matter of transforming the Kantian critique exercised in the form of a necessary limitation into a practical critique in the form of a possible overcoming. And this is the well-known quotation from a text of Foucault, what is enlightenment. So, and then what is at stake in this approach concerning the role of philosophy? Firstly, it is a question of approaching philosophy not as a univocal search for universal structures, as though ultimately risk proposing following the tradition established in the West. From Foucault's point of view, it is rather a matter of circumverting universals as much as possible, developing philosophical procedures capable of questioning the constitution and historical determination of universals. It is a question of dedicating oneself to the study of the concrete practices through which subjects constitute themselves in the immanence of the power relations from which they emerge. Can we still talk about spirituality? And secondly, what does it mean that there are different techniques? If philosophy defines its method in terms of exercise capable of criticizing the conditions of the possibility of any existence, what is at stake in this practice is not the question of the technique as a universal and a unique domain opposed to the nature. Rather, it is a plurality of different techniques which give rise to different forms of life. Their spirituality, therefore, consists of the creativity that makes the reversibility of the movements possible belonging to each technique, coinciding with historically situated strategic operations and not simply oriented toward the realization of ultimate, unique, and universalizing meaning. Foucault is not interested in the technique as a univocal issue, nor in revealing how it imposes itself on subjects as destiny. His path contrasts the general critique of technology, such as the one.
I went to lunch with a girl who sent her food back because she found a hair in it. I was like, the self-esteem you have to have. I would have to have a toupee on my lasagna. And even then, I'd be like, I am so sorry. I asked for this without toupee. I didn't. I should have. I'm sorry. You know what? Leave it. It's a.
Excuse me. On the nuts. If you possible, shut up the microphone. Thank you.
The reversibility.
Remember.
It's possible. So,
USA.
can I? Okay, then I would try to say that Foucault is not interested in the technique as a univocal issue, nor in revealing how it imposes itself on subjects as a destiny. His path contrasts the general critique of technology, such as the one, according to me, following as Heidegger's footsteps, which is more or less also implicitly present in adult perspective. His work, rather, is aimed at the study of the multiple and different technologies of the self, technologies of subjectivation and desubjectivation, always capable of operating within and against the devices in place, which define strategic situations and power relationships of forces, which for Foucault can only pass through bodies, and Hadot rather aims to evade. According to Foucault, bodies are objects of power, segregated, medicalized, monitorized, and punished, invested in by disciplinary and biopolitical devices, which naturalize life by referring to nature as an already available faun, which transforms sexuality itself into a technique of domination. For him, bodies are also at the origin of life's techniques in continuous transformation through the invention of different processes of subjectivation and the assumption of multiple practices of truth as practice of the self. So nature, of which our body is part, is today at the center of a specific narrative. Climate change, the crisis of ecosystems, pollutions, depletion of resources, and the collapse of the hyper-technological world, accelerated by the effects of the pandemics and the war. Discussion of these issues is often characterized by old ideas. A critical idea of technology as a dimension uniquely opposed to nature is still to order of the day, which risks not to neutralizing nature itself, thus also any element opposing the dominance of technology. From a point of view, Foucault proposes a philosophical re-semantization of the relationship between nature and technique, for which spiritual exercise and techniques of the self cannot be coincide, opposite to the Hadot's perspective. This is a project that defines the essentially critical role of philosophy as a form of life, addressed but through a different political use of the relationship between nature and technique or technology. A different political use that is extremely important for our time, I think. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Elettra, for your presentation. We have a bit of time for some questions. Well, first one, Hélder.
Thank you. I'll just take the microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. There were lots of interesting and stimulating points, and especially the aspect of bodies and how it differs in Foucault and Hadot. I was thinking about this more general objection that is often made to Hadot and Foucault, that the way they present the ideas often makes it difficult to distinguish between philosophy and religion. And I thought of this when you talk about different techniques, different forms of life. So the way you described it, made it perhaps a little bit difficult to distinguish what would be characteristic of philosophy as a technique of the self, because it seemed that this could apply to a number of forms of activity, of art, religion. So in your view, what is characteristic of philosophical exercises? So I don't have, Foucault has this idea of spirituality at the beginning of the hermeneutics of the subject, with the relation of truth, but that seems that could also be applied in a certain sense to religion, to art, to other forms of activity. Do you see any specificity of philosophy, or the standpoint from where Foucault is thinking is a standpoint for which this distinction is not relevant?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I think that is a specificity point of view of Foucault to focuses a new way to give a new power to philosophy as knowledge, and also as a knowledge that is a power, obviously. And this is the big issue in Foucaultian discourse. And the relation to technique, from my point of view, is very interesting, because is a way to rethink also the ancient, the origin of philosophy, and the way through which philosophy is precisely something practiced, and not only theoretically, also in Aristotle, for example, in which technique is connected to the specificity of a knowledge that is ethical. And this is the domain around which Foucault tried to define a new specificity of philosophy in terms of a technical knowledge which not cut living material and then bodies. And it is interesting the fact that Foucault made this way through Kant, through a new interpretation of Kant, a new interpretation of the Enlightenment as an exercise, as a practice. And I think that Kant is precisely the philosopher that also made this, that also focuses on this possibility to define philosophy not only as a pure reason, but as the discourse about the pure reason, nor about the practical reason, but about something that is aesthetic in the sense of material and then of technical. But this technical is not is related to nature and not opposed. This is, from my point of view, what Foucault was trying to reflect in his late work, and this is his interest of the late antiquity in the sense of this technique to view, in which the technique is not opposed to action, to ethical action, but an ethical sense. And obviously, this has also to do in some way with religion, with I would say with the religious experience, in the sense in which the religious experience has origin in the material life also. That is the experience of the transcendence becomes genealogically from the material life. And this material life have to do with our relation of the body also. And this is the domain that interests me, a domain in that maybe is not present in the Haddo definition of the spiritual, of the philosophy as spiritual exercise.
Thank you very much.
So we have Fabio, Marta, and Fabio for first.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and I was quite pleased by how clearly you define the different.
Sorry, can you open please?
And I was very pleased by the way you clearly define the differences between Haddo and Foucault, especially this fuses versus techne issue. But closer to the end of your talk, you tried to explain in what way this idea of the techne of the self and in Foucault could come about, and you connected it with the historical dissemination of universals, etc. And I was wondering to what effect, or what is the effect of the political power and the political structures that Foucault identifies, and to what extent those same political structures actually constrain and reduce the ability that the subject has to somehow form or transform their own way of being.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is an important question. The interest of Foucault is to focus the power of the universal concept, the universalization of concept that is characteristic of the Western thoughts. That is the power of Western thought. That is the way to which the Western thought dominated on the world. And this is the critical aspect of a perspective of a philosophy that take this seriously. That is not renouncing of the truth. This is not the perspective of Foucault. There is a truth, but this is true. It's not a relative truth. Is a possibility to each way make a deeply relationship to a self that is connected to the life. And this is the sense of the technique, a new rethinking of technique. It is not the technique that is the result of the universalization. This is Marta.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's really interesting to listen to your talk and revisit the never-ending debate between Haddo and Foucault. I have two very short and interrelated questions. The first one is, while it is clear that Haddo criticized Foucault and rejected, for instance, the idea of technologies of the self or its excessive concentration on the self, I might be wrong, but I think Foucault doesn't criticize or reject Haddo's idea of spiritual exercises. Indeed, it develops even more than Haddo the idea of spirituality. And if I'm not mistaken, he uses the notion of spiritual practices, if not spiritual exercises at some point, I'm not sure, but at least spiritual practices he does. So he does not reject the idea of spiritual something, spiritual exercises, practices, techniques. So I wonder if there was a very strong intention behind Foucault's reformulation of those practices as technologies of the self or techniques of the self, except for not wanting to use the exact same expression used by Hadot. I don't know if you have some ideas about that. If he does not reject the idea of spiritual practices, why did he opt for the technologies? And secondly, you seem to tend towards Foucault's interpretation in favor of Foucault, yeah, it's clear. And I was wondering what kind of implications you see in this, or the advantages of conceiving philosophy in a technological or technical way, or as a technique instead of a spiritual practice or a spirituality. Is there advantage for us today in considering philosophy as a technology and not as a spirituality?
Difficult question, thank you. Yeah, I think that for the first question, I think that Foucault found very interesting the Hadot perspective, and he used it. Was Hadot that criticized Foucault, and then in some way I take the place of Foucault to answer to the critic of Hadot, if so can say. Then the concept of spiritual exercise is important. For example, in the lecture hermeneutic of the subject, or also in the study la sexualité is a big concept for Foucault. And from this concept, he go back to the late antiquity and reinterpret the concept of the technology of the self, the ars vivendi and the techne to bio. In some way, the techne to bio is another way, is a translation from spiritual exercise. It's an interpreted translation of this. And the second question, so the reason why I take part for the technological perspective of philosophy today is why I think that is the issue of our time. We need spiritual dimension, we need utopia, we need to think about a new world. But I think that today maybe I think that the new generations in which the problem of the environmental issue and so on are not so much to have a new spiritual dimension, but to have a new technical approach to what they find wrong from the technique that is the domination of the world. And this is, so my perspective is to appropriate to what is dangerous and to make another sense of this. This is the reason why I use so maybe to start the concept of technology and technique related to also the spiritual dimension.
Okay. Very yes. John Sanders. And then yeah, two questions.
Yes, thank you. So this is just really a comment rather than a question, but I wonder if a lot of this contrast between Hadot and Foucault comes down to different implicit assumptions about human nature, right? So if you think that
human beings are a blank sheet of paper waiting to be created, then you might think of some kind of technological process of creation or an aesthetics. If you think that there's some kind of fundamentally good human nature that's been corrupted in some way in the process, then you might think of a kind of a medical model, right? We've been corrupted, we need a medicine of the mind to fix us and get us back to our human nature. Or if, like Hélder, you think that ultimately humans need to be understood as part of some larger whole, and so the solution is to in some way dissolve our everyday sense of self so we can reconnect with that larger whole. All of those different ways of thinking about this the difference all seems to come down to different implicit assumptions about what human nature is, rather than kind of being engaged in some sort of radically different project. That might be one way in which we can think about the contrast that's going on here.
Yeah, thank you. This is very important. The point is that Foucault decided the concept of human nature as such. For example, in the dialogue with Noam Chomsky, he said that there is not a human nature. This is the point. This is precisely the point. This is the point why the human being are from the beginning, if so we can say, are technical life, because they are not nature in the sense that something always so. And this is the point, also the difference, the big difference, I think, between the two. Thank you.
Pavel?
No,
Okay, sorry. Excuse me. Leonard.
The way you present this is fascinating. I mean, each in a way accuses the other of neglecting something. So Hélder thinks Foucault neglects what he's concerned with, which is a kind of spiritual awakening that you find in Aristotle, for example. And Foucault thinks Hélder just blinks the power relations and the body. And so one thing I was wondering is whether you could see some kind of synthesis through a kind of process of a sequence, like with Kierkegaard's, multiple self-revolutions, from an aesthetic to an ethical, and from an ethical to a religious standpoint. I wonder whether you think, I mean, it would take a kind of creative effort, but whether a synthesis could be made out of the analyses of these thinkers.
Now the problem is that was Adorno that end of that when Foucault was died, that criticized Foucault. Foucault couldn't answer to the critic. This is the problem. This is also a little not so it's a little problematic, because there was not a really dialogue between the two.
Yes, but you have created one in a way.
Yeah, I have really created.
And so it's possible to go on from your talk to think about ways of joining the insights and practices of both thinkers. And I don't want to be too superficial here, but it seems to me there's work to be done, because the idea of a creative transformation of itself on the one hand, and a kind of unselfing in this kind of larger unity with the whole, they're not incompatible, especially in a kind of sequence of growth.
Yeah, no, it is possible in the sense that obviously it is important to reappropriate to a whole dimension, common dimension, that is this nature that is so important in Adorno, but not in the sense of a static dimension. In this sense, we can go on.
Yes.
You understand? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elettra, for your talk. I just wanted to brief comment, which is also connected to John's question. I remember reading a paper by Jonathan Ganeri. I think the paper is called Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault, where he clearly addresses this question of the tension between Hadot and Foucault. And he does that in the sense that John was trying to explain us that whether we theorize those as spiritual exercises or technologies of the self, put it now on side. But the question was how this relates to the theory or model of self that they, all these authors have, one, and the second, what is exactly how the activities of spiritual exercises or technologies of the self, how do they build upon the self? Ganeri deals with them in the following way. He said that what we have is two different models. The one is advancing and defending the model of subtraction, and Hadot likes very much to recall, Plotinus and sculpting the self. You just have to take out, and the self is there. So you do not create it anew, you just take out. Whereas the Dandism then would instead be related to that idea of the model of not subtraction, but to addition. That is, what you do is you add, you create. So whatever they are spiritual exercises or technologies of the self, now they are adding something new, whereas on the other model, they take away, they subtract. I wonder what will be your take on how Ganeri discussed that.
Very interesting question. Yes, thank you. The problem of self is the big problem in the nature. The problem is the nature, the human nature, and the self. What is the role with the two dimensions in relation to exercise, and then in relation to spirituality and technology? The question of the self. So from my point of view, the perspective of Foucault help us to use another dimension of the self that is not a self that have to necessarily identify with himself. That is also a big problem of the Western thought, in addition to the universalization. And then the technique of the self for Foucault is precisely the way through which, through an addition, through a creation, the self could have more way with peace. This is not a problem, because it is so. And this is what we need also today, to have more way for oneself. And then, thank you.
So,
Yes, very, very quick.
Yeah, so just building off on the same thing, it seems that Foucault and Hadot both are focused on self and transformation. Hadot is a return. The world changes us, we want to go back. Foucault is, we want to progress further, we want to return. And I don't necessarily think you have to choose one or the other, right? Life changes us. And I think one of the points earlier was that everything changes, whether you're a scientist, farmer, the world changes us. And maybe Hadot's techniques help us rediscover that self prior to those. So the meditations at the end of the day, when we look over the day, we're like, hey, this is what happened to me. But Foucault's method is, how do I change then myself actively, consciously, on purpose, right? And both of them combined can progress further.
I don't know if Foucault is only a conscious dimension, because this is a more complicated dimension, the self itself.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I agree. Thank you.
Okay, I cannot avoid to say something, because it's a really interesting, the fact that you highlighted over this divergent agreement between Hadot and Foucault, because the points of departure, it seems to me, are really completely different. Because Hadot, it seems precisely through this absence of the bodies, and of speaking of also answering about questioning about about how eventually the spiritual exercise intervene on the bodies at the opposite of Foucault. Continue to be until the end an interpreter of philosophy as a discipline. Quite the opposite. Foucault's attempt is to interpret philosophy as one of the techniques that the antiquity invented. And through the techniques of prediction and of the bodies. So, yeah,
I am agree. Again.
So thank you very much, Elettra, for this talk.